So there came a day when King Saul, the one who was chasing David, he died on the field of battle. And it was against the Amalekites, and the Amalekites were the sworn enemy of God and of Israel. And it was on a day, it talks about this in 2 Samuel, uh, actually chapter 1, where David had been out also fighting the Amalekites. He had come back in, and then this messenger comes to him, a messenger who turns out to be an Amalekite, and his clothing's ripped, and he's got dirt on his forehead, and his story is a bit fabricated. So maybe he pinched himself, so he's crying. He passes himself like a mourner, and he has this bad news to say to King David that, well, he wasn't king yet, but that Saul is dead. And it says there that, tell me, how did you come upon this? Where'd you come from? And says David, and he says, I've escaped from the camp of Israel. And he goes that he came upon Saul, who was leaning on his sword, and basically that Saul was saying to him, my life is gone from me, but take my sword and strike me down, that I may die with honor, etc., etc. This is the way of an Amalekite, and David, he's not really believing him, but because it's by his own mouth, this guy says he killed Saul, the king, it doesn't go well for him. David, you remember David, he had this heart of touch not God's anointed one. He had many chances to actually kill Saul, but didn't, because he's God's man for the hour. He was God's king, and he wasn't going to touch him. And so here comes this fella who's saying, hey, I did the good deed. I took his crown. I took his armband, and yeah, I killed him. So he was probably expecting some sort of reward. And David, here's his response. Then David took hold of his own clothes, and he tore them, and so did all the men who were with him, and they mourned and they wept and they fasted that day. So this Saul was the guy who was chasing them. He's the reason they're in the desert caves, King Saul. But when he died, David and all his men mourned, which would have been a huge statement to all his people. It says they wept and they fasted until evening for Saul, and also for Jonathan, Saul's son, who died with him. And that's part of the reason why this is not a true story, in the sense that this Amalekite was telling him, because both Saul and Jonathan, come on. And it says that David asked the young man, how do you know that this Saul and Jonathan are dead? And he goes, the young man says that he'd come along, he found him leaning on his sword, he took the crown, he took the armband, he took his sword, and he killed him. And David said to him, how is it you're not afraid to put out your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed? And David called one of the young men and said, execute him. That's brutal times, but he said he struck them down that day so that he died. And David said to him, your blood be on your own head, for your own mouth has testified against you, saying, I have killed the Lord's anointed. David and his men go into mourning, and they mourn the one who fell in battle, the one who was the one who caused them so much grief. You have people in your own life that cause you a lot of grief. What would be your attitude if something bad happened to them? Proverbs 24:17 and 18 says, do not rejoice when your enemy falls. Let not your heart be glad when he stumbles, lest the Lord sees your heart, and is displeased, and then turns away his anger from your enemy. He's saying basically, look, when something bad happens to people that don't like you, when something goes sideways in their lives, we're not to have like this sense of rejoicing. We're not to be happy for that. We're not to rejoice in wrong. We're supposed to have a good attitude. In fact, we might all need to just dial back on who we think is our enemy. Remember, David was a man after God's own heart, and how he treated people seems like God was pretty pleased overall. Next week, we're going to look at how he treated a guy named Mephibosheth, which he was a relative of King Saul and somebody who treated David badly. Let's see, how did David treat him? Oh God, teach us your ways, that we would be more like you and not like us.